Okay, so let's, grade 12s, let's get started on sequential file handling. Okay, so this is our new grade 12 unit that I'm going to introduce to you guys right now. It's going to probably challenge some of the things that you take for granted when you hear of files in computers. Okay? Now, the thing about your programming up to this point is every piece of data you've stored has been temporary. It's been stored in the form of a variable or an array or a class or some sort of complex data structure, but it is only available while the program is running. The second your program stops, any of that data is lost. Or if, say, the computer gets unplugged, the data is lost. So the problem with these data structures are they are temporary, and they are also defined as volatile. They're volatile data structures. If you want to permanently store data, you're going to need to write your data to a permanent data structure, and typically that is known as a file. Okay. Your computers use a system to organize the files, and any computer needs that type of system. Whether it's a computer or an MP3 player or a phone, it needs a way to organize the files. It needs a system of organization. Most, when we talk about computers, store data on some sort of permanent or persistent storage device, which could be a metal hard disk, it could be a solid state piece of memory, it could be something as simple as a USB key, or if we want to do a little bit of throwback, a floppy disk or a CD disk, some sort of permanent storage device. But when it saves it, it gives the file a very, very specifically unique name. Okay? Now, the way the naming system works on computers generally follows this convention. Okay? And I think you probably knew this already, that there was the name itself. Like, let's say you're saving a picture of your dog, right? And you called it Fluffy, right? Fluffy would be the name of the file. But there's way more to it than that. What you probably know, although it's not often something you type in when you save that picture, is that that file has what's called an extension. So for example, for a photo, it might be something like .jpeg. Okay, that extension is used by the system to identify what kind of file it is. So that if you say double click it or something like that, it knows, oh, this is a picture. I should probably help my user by launching a photo viewing program. It makes it easier for them, rather than them having to launch the photo viewing program and then try and find the file. But as well, a part that's often something you don't think about is the path to get there. Where is that picture saved? Where is that file organized into? And that usually involves some sort of folder system generally. Okay? That folder system usually starts with a single letter, usually a letter that's identified for the drive itself that it's stored on, so the C drive or the D drive. And then depending on the system, I'm going to use, say, Windows, for example, it would be a colon and then maybe a series of slash characters to indicate the directory. Okay? We often just call that the path. But when we think of files, we want to also think of these three things in a slightly different way. Okay? So some terms you're going to need to become aware of. Directories start at what's called the root directory. That's the beginning directory. Okay? Then subdirectories will come out of this, or sometimes we use the term folders, will come out of that, and they're often separated by a backslash or, in some systems, a forward slash character. Okay? For example, in Unix systems, they use a forward slash system. Okay? Then the file name. And generally, there are some rules on all these things. The rules have opened up over the years. If you think of that old computer I have in the back corner, when I use that computer, you're actually only allowed to use 8 characters when you saved a file name. And none of them could be a space. So you have some really unique names that would come out of that time when people would name their files. Okay? But even in today's system, there are certain characters, like you can't use an exclamation point and stuff like that in the name of your file because it doesn't allow those characters. Okay? Yeah. Okay. And then the extension. which also has its own limitations. It used to be that the extension was limited to only 3 characters, which is why JPEGs are named JPG, and then sometimes you find them on the internet, they're called JPEG. Well, it's actually an acronym. It stands for Joint Photograph Experts Group. That's what JPEG stands for, which should include the E, Joint Photograph Experts Group. But when they first created the format known as JPEG format, and they created the extension, they weren't allowed to put an E in there because they were limited to 3 characters. But now they're not limited to 3 characters, and that's why now it's JPEG. If you know anything about web pages, that's why some web pages are HTML and some are just HTM. Okay? There's an extension sort of legacy there with some programmers. Okay? But here's the term I want you to become more familiar with. We're going to now call those 3 parts of the file name the first, middle, and last name of a file. Okay? So, here's an example. That's the path name to this file. Okay, starting at the root directory, the single letter, the colon, the slashes, the folders, then the file name itself, and then its extension. Okay? But you could also call this file's first, middle, and last name. Okay? Because here's the rule that most systems use. The rule is no 2 files can have the same first, middle, and last name. They have to be unique. Now, what that means is that 2 files could have the same first name. Like there could be inside of C My Documents multiple files there because they all have the same first name. They could even have the same first name and the same last name. So in other words, you could have a whole bunch of text files inside of this folder. You could have 2 files that have the same first name and the same last name, or sorry, middle name. So you could have inside of C My Documents, you could have employee record.txt, and you could have employee record.jpg and employee record.doc. That wouldn't violate the rule. Okay? As long as you don't have 2 files with the same first, middle, and last name, the system allows it. Okay? Because otherwise, it wouldn't know how to organize those files because they'd be too identical. So no 2 first identical middle and last name on any system. And that's Mac, PC, Unix, whatever. Okay, so these files are organized into various formats. But now when we get down to the nitty-gritty, how does a file actually work? Okay? What we're going to look at is a type of file known as a sequential access file. Basically, it is a text file. Okay? A file of purely plain text. Now, does that mean it could never be a picture or anything like that? Well, no, not necessarily. But that's the format we're going to start with, is this sequential access file. Okay. So what sequential files do is they store basically characters that are available in the ANSI table. Now, ANSI, you may look at there, is a subset of the ASCII character set. Okay? And basically, if I just flip to the next page, it's a bunch of collection of characters. Okay? It's actually the first 127 characters from the ASCII table. And you may recall, I'm just going to turn the light on for a second. That's a chart of the ASCII table right in the back of the room there. But there are characters within that table that are not standard from computer system to computer system, Mac to PC to other systems. Okay? So ANSI is the first 127 for sure are part of every system. And it's often a lot of characters that are beyond the scope of the keyboard itself. Like when you click keys on your keyboard, you have a certain number you can present, but there are certainly way more. Okay? And one of the simplest ones you could think about is the Enter key on your keyboard. The Enter key on your keyboard seems like a fairly simple key to just think about. But in fact, it's not. There's a little bit to it, more to it, than just hitting Enter. Okay? And to show that, did I launch it? I thought I launched it. I just want to, sorry, I should have had this up. I just want to draw a quick diagram And I want you to just for a second stare at that enter key on your keyboard. Not the word enter, but the character that's underneath it. It looks like this, right? That's the way they drew it. And now I have to ask you guys if any of you have ever seen an old mechanical typewriter. Not an electric typewriter, not a computer keyboard, but a mechanical typewriter. None of you have seen this? None of you have ever seen one of those? Okay, well, let me try to draw it really badly, but something like that, right? And what you may remember, if you've ever seen these, is there's something right here. What is that? Anyone know what that is? And an old mechanic. Boy, you guys are really. It's an arm thing, and what it does is you have to use this thing, because what happens is, as you start typing, okay, as you hit keys on here, what it does is it causes a mechanical arm to swing up. So if you hit the A key, a mechanical arm for A will swing up, and there's a ribbon right here. And that ribbon is covered in ink. And what the mechanical arm does is it hits the ribbon, which then on the other side of this is a piece of paper, hits the paper, and it stamps the letter onto the paper. By hitting the ink and then hitting the paper, it stamps the letter A there. And when you release the letter A, that mechanical arm goes back down. Okay? If you hit another character, it does the same thing. Then this thing that I drew that looks like a cylinder is where the paper rolls on. As you type, this thing, which is called the carriage, okay, moves this direction. It actually moves physically. So every time you press a key, it will move over one. Okay? So that will allow you to type the cat ran, because as you hit T, stamps the T, H, it moves over one, then you put the H, it's beside it, right? It's not on top of it. So this is called the carriage, and it moves along. So if you've ever seen those old mechanical typewriters, when you get to the end of the line, this thing will be way over here. It actually moves along back and forth. The reason that arm is there is when you get to the end of the line, actually the arm's on this side, I drew it on the wrong side, you use it to push the carriage all the way back. You return the character back to its original spot. But when you pull that arm to return it, it also does one other thing. It rolls the carriage, it spins it a little bit. The reason it spins it is to move the paper down as well. So what's going on here is you're typing letters into the typewriter. When you get to the end of the line, it will do two things. It will, one, return back to the beginning of the line, and what's called a line feed. It feeds it down to the next line, which is actually two things happening there, which is why under the enter key they draw it like this, because you are performing what's called a carriage return and a line feed. A line feed and a carriage return are the two things that happen when you hit the end of a line, when you press that key down. And what the ASCII table sees is these are two separate characters. Not one character, but two of them. And actually, if you look it up on the ASCII table, you'll see that these are actually two characters, not one. So when you hit enter, it's actually inserting two invisible characters into your file. So let's think about that. You write a poem, because you're a very poetic gentleman. The cat ran to the mat. Beautiful poem, exclamation point. Okay? Let's think about this if you were to save it to a file. Okay? If you were to save this to a file, each of these would be characters. Okay? A T, a H, a E, a space, that's a character. a C, a T, and then one more, believe it or not. Or is it one more? There are two more characters there. There is a carriage return and a line feed. Two characters sitting there. They're invisible to you, but they're in there. And then comes the next line, same thing. RAN space. Let's say I had two spaces. Let's say I was one of those typers that put two. A T, an O, a carriage return, a line feed. And the next line, THE space MAT exclamation point. Now let's say I didn't have a carriage return there. Let's say I didn't. Okay? Oop. Come on. There's one other invisible character there. Okay? There's actually an invisible character there called the end of file marker. That indicates that this file is done. And now the way you can think of a text file like that is all just one long string of characters. I've drawn them as three separate things here, but I was going to try to use the smartboard to move these up, but it just won't work right now. But right when it gets to here, it would then pick up the R. So all of this is just one stream of characters. Okay? Like flowing water, all of these characters will flow into the file when you save it and when you open it, and the way it displays it on the screen will depend on certain characters that it encounters. Okay? We're going to pause there for today. We'll pick up on this tomorrow, but it's important you get a grip on the way files actually are being saved.